We get like to the end of the semester, it's like less and less of us every day, as everyone's trying to hang in there. But did everyone have a good break? Or a good Thanksgiving? I guess we didn't technically have much of a break, but who ate too much? I ate so much. I was like almost sick, but my mother-in-law didn't food poison me, so that was like a really good, I survived, right? We were all so scared, but the turkey was like overdone, so it was super dry, but at least it was done, right? So I didn't get sick on Thanksgiving. I got a new phone. It's very exciting. 7 hours at Verizon later. It's like I was in that store for 7 hours. It was ridiculous. But I got a new watch and a new phone for Christmas. Early Christmas presents to myself, right? I guess I got my kids' phones. That'll be interesting. My 9-year-olds are like, we get phones, right? I'm like, I don't know. You have to earn it. So they're trying desperately to earn their phones before Christmas, which is just hilarious. So I'm like, how long can I milk this? They're like, we'll do chores. I'm like, okay, let's do it. So, morning. All right. So if you're looking at our time here, we don't have a lot of time left together, which sounds kind of sad, right? It is a little sad. It's exciting, but it's sad. So we have today and Wednesday, and then Monday, and then we have our final, right? So we really have like 3 classes and then our final exam. So that's kind of all we have left. What we'll look at today, and I know as we were talking about, not the happiest of topics to come back to, but it is an important one to talk about, so we will. We'll talk about chapter 17 today, and then we have 18, which is selling sex, so pornography and prostitution and so on. And then we'll take our final. So hopefully over last week, I gave you that video to watch on chapter 16. If you haven't watched it, at some point, make sure you do, since we're not talking about 16, kind of an easy, short chapter. But we will pick up here, we'll go through this, and then we have our final next week, which I'll probably talk more about on Wednesday. So I'll talk about that and the closing assignment on Wednesday. So hang in there, we're almost there. So what we'll look at today, things that relate to sexual coercion. And again, not the easiest of topics. I imagine a lot of you have either known somebody who's been a victim of one of these things, or maybe even been close to one of these things, but it is an important thing to talk about. So bear with me, we'll get through it together, but we'll talk a little bit about coercion and sexual violence and consent, and some of the types of coercion and violence. So when a person is deprived of their free choice, they're coerced or they're forced to comply with any kind of like sexual act under threat or duress or stress, we tend to consider that like sexual violence or sexual coercion. And there are a couple of different types of that we'll talk about, but the whole essence here is that this person has not given their consent. Now, consent is a really tricky thing. There's a lot of different elements to consent, which we'll talk about shortly. But the essence here is that you aren't giving your choice in the matter. Maybe you feel like you have no choice, or you're threatened, maybe you're too young to give your consent, or you're under the influence of something, but there's a sexual violence that's occurring against your will. Right? And again, I imagine a lot of you have known somebody, sadly, this is not uncommon, which is again, a little bit difficult to like process, but it is true. Right. So one of the most common types of sexual violence or sexual coercion is rape or sexual assault, which is the completed or attempted unwanted vaginal, oral, or anal penetration through the use of physical force, threats of violence, or when somebody is under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Right. So there's a lot of elements to that. Right. So this is somebody who is having some kind of like sexual like behavior pushed upon them against their will. And there's a couple of different types of rape that can occur: stranger, acquaintance, date, and statutory. Right? So 4 different types, which would be a great short answer question for you. Stranger rape, like it sounds, is somebody you don't know, which actually is not that common, right? We tend to think of rape as being something that's perpetrated by someone we don't know, but it's actually like the least common of the 4 that are up here. Acquaintance rape is when it's somebody who's like a friend, or like an acquaintance, somebody you don't know that well, but you are familiar with. It's someone who's known to the victim. And this is actually the most common of the 4. right? Oftentimes this is something that's perpetrated by someone that you know, which is slightly like frightening to think about, but a acquaintance, a friend, right? If it's a family member that technically could fall into this category as well. Date rape, somebody that you are like in a romantic relationship with. And then statutory rape, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, is somebody who's under the age of consent. So someone who's typically considered a child, even though maybe they're a teenager, that would still fall into this category. With every single one of these, right, somebody has not given their consent. And again, consent is something that is really tricky. Jasmine talked about it a little bit when she came in for her presentation. I love her, by the way. I hope you enjoyed her. I think she's great. But with consent, it's a conscious mind and body alignment of both partners. So both people are agreeing to whatever sexual act they're engaging in, but they have a willingness or an excitement, at least an agreement to what they're doing. Now, there are quite a few barriers to consent, right? Age is a big one, right? So in California, and this is different from place to place, but age is one we could put up here. And the age here is 18, right? In some places it's 16, but in California, right, the age of consent is 18 years old. So technically being 16, 17, you're under the age of consent. Very rarely do we like follow up on like two people who are 15 or 16 or 17 having sex with each other, as long as it is something that is like consensual, but technically it could fall under statutory rape. Where it gets tricky is if you have someone who's 18 and someone who's like 15 or 16, right? Because then you have one person who's over the age and one who's under. But age is one big barrier to consent. Another one is any kind of intimidation or use of fear, right? Threatening someone, right? Which we could add like force or a threat. If somebody doesn't feel like they can make a choice because maybe they have a threat against their life, or someone is holding a knife or a gun to them, right? And all of those things would be barriers to consent. Alcohol and drugs. That was really wrong. Alcohol and drugs are two big barriers. If somebody is under the influence to the point where they're not aware enough to make a decision, that's a barrier to consent. And obviously then being unconscious would also be, maybe someone has had too much to drink and they've passed out, right? Or they're under the influence of something and they're not consciously awake, right? All of these things are kind of barriers or issues that can affect somebody's ability to give consent. If you're unconscious or not in your normal conscious mind, you can't agree to something. Now, I have a video I want to show you, and it's not, there's nothing like bad in it. It's just a little cringy to watch. The person who made this video, Lacey Green, she's a very popular like YouTuber, social media person. And it's a little uncomfortable at times because she shows you what consent can look like, but I think it's important to watch anyway. So I'm going to play it for you. Again, nothing like that I need to give you like trigger warnings about, just a little like awkward at moments, but I do think that it's important. So let me play it for you. Just like nonverbal like signals of what consent can look like. I think that's really important. Just put that back. Many buttons here, and I could add up here, like she mentioned, power dynamics would be another one that we could add. Right, when you have a situation where somebody has power over you, like they mentioned, like a teacher or a therapist, somebody who has some level of like a status change from you. If you're not on an equal like playing field, you might feel like you have to comply or have to give in because of that dynamic. So again, the commonality here is with all these different types, you know, somebody, it doesn't have consent, right? And again, these are some of the barriers like she talked about and we talked about to being able to give your consent. Any like thoughts or comments, anything so far? Anything on our happy topic as we come back from break? Okay. Prevalence, really difficult to know how frequently this occurs because a lot of people don't report, you know, instances of sexual violence, whether it's rape or whatnot. But you could see in 2015, which is getting a little old, There were 431,000 and so like cases reported in the United States, which is quite a bit. Typically, what we see is that the media plays a big role in this. Things like pornography, movies where they depict like, you just have to keep pushing and somebody will cave or give in. When we look at characteristics of rapists, it's more of an act of power and control than it is necessarily about sex. Tends to be something that's much more correlated with like domination and control than it is about like sexual release or pleasure, right? And so this tends to be something typically that's perpetrated by men, right? And victims of rape stereotypically tend to be women, right? Typically between the ages of like 16 to 24 is the most common. Now, obviously men can be raped as well, right? It is much, much less common, much less reported, but it typically is women, right? Perpetrated by men, right? For the most part, though, again, it can go the other way as well. A lot of use of things like date rape drugs, right, as a part of this. Really cool. There's some really like amazing new products that have come out to help people detect these. There's a really neat like nail polish that you can put on, and it's clear, right? And so can be worn by anyone really, but nail polish like being more and more common. But it's really interesting. You put it on your finger, right? And if you put your finger in a drink, it will detect if there's any of these drugs present in the drink. It'll change color, right? And so there's all these like products like that to help protect people. Really sad that we need them, but amazing that they are becoming more available. There's a lot of prevalence of date rape drugs being used in like combination with people being sexually assaulted, right? Because the way that these drugs work, drugs like Rohypnol, GHB, ketamine hydrochloride, and obviously alcohol, which she talked about a little bit as well. With all of these drugs, what they tend to do is they cause you to be sedated. They make you sleepy, so you kind of pass out or fall asleep, and they have memory loss that tend to be part of them, right? And so these are things that can oftentimes be slipped into a drink, right? And they're odorless, right? They're flavorless. They don't change the color of anything. And so people consume that drink, right? And then, find themselves passed out somewhere, right? So again, something to be really careful of with like if you go to a party or if you go to a bar, somebody buys you a drink, right? You want to be really careful with that, or somebody hands you a drink. If you're at a party, keep your hand over your drink, right? Like little things to protect yourself, because you never know, right? If somebody can slip something into one of them, like one of these drugs, they tend to be very commonly used when it comes to sexual assault. Couple other things here. Very common for somebody who has been a victim of sexual assault to have long-term consequences of that, right? And this can be something that can be difficult, right? Not only for that person, but maybe for a partner or for family members or friends. Very similar to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People can develop what's called rape trauma syndrome. Follows a very similar pattern where people go through this like two-stage response. Right? The first is kind of like the immediate stuff of anger or shock or fear or resentment or depression, right? Kind of like immediate reactions. But it can also cause some very long-term like changes for somebody. If somebody has gone through something where they lost the ability to consent, they had a sexual violence perpetrated against them, they might have a difficult time with intimacy. They might have a hard time with trust. Or certain situations might trigger them in a very like PTSD kind of way. So what you sometimes see is that people, especially if they were young, have what's called traumatic sexualization occur, right? Where maybe they have like an inappropriate amount of sexuality. They can become like hypersexual, or they might even go to the other end of the spectrum and not be interested in sex at all. So it can be something where you need to be very patient with somebody as a partner, especially if they've been a victim of any kind of like sexual violence. They might struggle, and there might be certain things that are triggers for them that you have to be aware of. Now, other people sadly undergo stuff like this and they're okay, right? It doesn't cause like a long-term issue, but this is relatively common to occur And it's really important to be supportive of people if they've had something happen to them, right? If somebody has had a situation where they have been sexually violated, to be understanding and be sympathetic and how can I support you? How can I help you? Rather than maybe judging them or not believing them. Sometimes people, that's the way they respond, right? I'm not going to believe you because they're in denial, but trying to find ways to be supportive, what can I do? And talking about it and so on are very, very important. Before we move on from this type of sexual violence, any comments, questions, thoughts, anything, stories at all, anything at all? Another very unfortunately common type of sexual abuse or sexual violence is child sexual abuse. So this is when an adult, so someone who's over the age of 18, right, is engaging in any kind of sexual contact with someone who's under 18. So inappropriate touching, oral genital stimulation, sex or coitus, anything with somebody who is under the age of consent. And specifically, we might call this like pedophilia or child molestation, when an adult and child who are not related to each other engage in some kind of sexual activity. Now, if they are related, technically it's considered incest, right? If it's someone who's like a family member, an uncle, a brother, a sister, an aunt, whatever, then we typically call that incest. Most of the time, this is somebody who is like known to a child, right? It might be, it could be a family member. It's stereotypically like a heterosexual male, though again, this could be anyone. There's no classic like profile for somebody who's a pedophile. And this often goes really, really underreported. What are some reasons this might be like really underreported? Can you think of any reasons why this might be something we don't know the statistics on? Yeah, right. They might not know how, right? Or to who? Like, well, who do I say this to? And how do I do that? Can you think of anything else? Any other reasons why it might be really underreported? Yeah.
The child might not know what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the like biggest reasons, right? Is they might not know that it was wrong. They're like, oh, I don't even know what that was, right? Or they don't want to get one of their parents or a family member in trouble, right? Let's say it's one of their parents, right? They don't want to tell the other parent. They might not be believing them. They don't want like their other parent to go to jail or have like consequences. This is very, very, very underreported, right? And sadly, it does definitely happen. And it can be very severely traumatizing and have long-term consequences for people, right? Again, going back to that last one, that traumatic sexualization isn't uncommon to occur, right? Or just having struggles with intimacy later in life. But this is something that does happen and can have some very like long-term consequences for people because they've been violated or had a lack of consent at such a young age. Another type of sexual violence or coercion, sexual harassment. This one is always really interesting to me because it's such a different line for everybody. Everybody has their line of what they're comfortable with or not comfortable with, right? Like you might not be okay with a coworker hugging you, right? Or like calling you nicknames of some sort, and other people are fine with it. And that makes stuff like sexual harassment really, really tricky. There's a couple of different types. This basically is any kind of unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature in the workplace or academic setting, anywhere where there's like a power dynamic or a situation where you're like at work or even at school. The two main types here, quid pro quo and hostile environment. Quid pro quo is when somebody is saying like, basically, I'll do this if you do this kind of thing. It's like an exchange. Compliance with unwanted sexual advances is a condition for securing a job or benefits in some way. If you have sex with me, I'll give you that promotion that you've been wanting. If you perform this behavior, you'll get that A in the class, right? I'll give you this for this, right? And it's oftentimes for some kind of like benefit or favorable treatment. Versus hostile environment is something that makes the workplace or environment uncomfortable, right? So maybe it is somebody who makes inappropriate comments. I had a teacher in my community college who used to flirt with like all of his students, right? And most of them didn't mind, but if people mind, it makes it uncomfortable, right? Like he thought it was funny, right? I think, but a lot of people didn't find it funny. They found it uncomfortable, right? So if people are doing things in the workplace or in a classroom in an environment that makes it uncomfortable or intolerable or hostile, that would fall under that second category. And I have a little video that I found that it kind of shows some examples of all of this. I think it's a really cool little animation. They're dogs. I'm not sure why they're dogs, but it's still, I think, a really good example. And I'll play it for you. We can see this. The one thing that I like that irritates me a little bit about that video is the way that they portray like the main person or main dog or whatever, the girl, right? That's very common. It's to like see the person who's the victim of these things as like kind of prudish in a way, like, oh, like just relax, just calm down. But if that's your environment that you're trying to work in and feel safe in and comfortable in, and you're dealing with all those things, you have every right to be put out and upset and uncomfortable, right? But we tend to portray people who are victims of this as being like, like hypersensitive or kind of uptight. And these things can make your life very uncomfortable. And I think, again, what makes this so tricky is everybody has a different line. Like some people might be fine with being called babe or having someone put their hand on your shoulder. Other people, not at all. Right. I had an example of this, and gosh, this was so many years ago at this point. But when I was 18, I was working at Yosemite National Park for the summer. One of the coolest things, I like worked there several summers when I was younger. I loved it. I worked flipping hamburgers for like the whole summer, and it was like the best job. I had no responsibility whatsoever, right? I loved it. And my boss was like the biggest pervert ever, right? And I thought it was hilarious. Like personally, like I'm really hard to offend, right? And I have a good sense of humor, right? So my boss, big, heavy, like mid-40s, like overweight, balding guy, just to paint a picture for you. Like he would just say the most inappropriate stuff all the time. And it made me laugh, right? He'd be like, how about you jump in there between those two burger buns? I'm like, those buns are way too small, Chris. Like, it's not gonna happen, right? Like it didn't bother me ever. And like I'd spill like ketchup and he'd be like, I'll get that for you. And I'd be like, that's gross. No. Like I had no problem with it. And everyone else in our like little like burger place had no problem with it. And it was all fine. But then we had a new employee come in and she was incredibly offended by it. It made her uncomfortable and she reported him and he was gone. Right. And I'm not saying that he was in the right, like his comments were wildly inappropriate. But it is so hard to know what people are okay with. And that's what makes this really, really tricky. And this is something that people are often struggling with. I'll typically have a lot of students who are like waiters or waitresses or work in like customer service related jobs where you are taught that the customer is always right, right? That you have to like cater to the customer, but that doesn't mean you have to tolerate all of this either, right? Some of you nodding, I mean, anyone like struggled with this in a workplace environment? Comment stories, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, his argues at 70 and wants to make comments. And then it got something my dad came in and quit 40.
Okay.
It'll be going. So yeah, I've had.
Yeah.
I was like older, so the owner was like, well, he's been with us for forever, so you know I'm not here with him.
Wow. Okay. And like not supporting you either. That's awful, right? And that happens too, where people don't get the support they need, even though it's making your life really uncomfortable. Jen, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah, I worked for a company. We were all women and this one woman was sexually harassed. We didn't know like she was doing it to everyone. I had quit and was working somewhere else, but the employees called me and then said, can you come have lunch with us? And we want to talk about something. And the person there had contacted a lawyer and she had paper for us all to sign. If she wanted to keep her job.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't like, it was worse for some people than others, for sure.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, the biggest thing, like that happens in families.
Yeah.
That kids each other.
Yeah, it can be in any environment, right? Where it's making it uncomfortable in some way. Yeah, you had your.
It's not like so bad.
Sure.
When I served the young sports girl on like Panera,
Mm-hmm.
and
clientele there was so bad. Like, it was all just like middle-aged men making really creepy comments.
Sure.
Doing all this stuff. It was so creepy and weird.
Mhm.
But,
Yeah, yeah. Really common in restaurants and bars and places where like you have people who are drinking, which only facilitates, like, kind of inhibiting like some of the filter, right, that could normally be there. But it's tricky in those situations because it's customers, right? And like your whole point, you want to make good tips, you want to get good money, you want to be supported, and yet all those things don't always happen together, right? It can be really awkward and uncomfortable enough so that you had to leave, right? You had your hand up as well. Yeah.
So it's not a restaurant, it's a job that I work right now.
Yeah.
Last year, there was this guy, we call him camera guy because he always came in like all camera.
Mhm.
Head to toe. And he would like make advances for every one of us, but like at different times. And I think maybe, oh no, it was like years ago. It was when I first started working there. That's crazy. The only reason I know why is because I was 17. That's why I remember that.
Yeah.
Because he would be creepy and weird. And then one day I told him, I was like, well, no, I'm a minor, like I'm not 18 yet. And he like made a funny, like a joke about it, like, oh, well, blah, 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 just basically saying that he didn't really care. And I'm like, oh, okay, got it. Nice. Love that. And then once I kind of started like being really firm with like, hey, don't talk to me, you know what I mean? He went to my other coworkers and like one of them, she like kind of tried to tell him no over and over again. He wasn't really listening, gave her his number, and she was like, oh, sorry, like I'm like fine. It had to get to the point where she was like, hey, I'm a lesbian, like I have a girlfriend, like no, thank you, I'm not interested. And he was like, oh, well, me and your lady friend can go out sometime, blah, blah, blah.
Everyone's all like, yeah. Yeah.
So then finally, well, our boss isn't did anything about it. So we just kind of like all told each other, we're like, we are not gonna engage with this guy. Like
Yeah.
he comes in, we're like, hey, that's it. Like he asks his questions, be short, you know what I mean? Because it's like you can't really talk to someone like that. It's not really like getting your like the hints of no, and then also just like no, like I don't want this. Like, so weird. It was so weird.
Yeah, and then to not have the support of like, like you said, your manager not really doing anything about it. And that's really common. And they get in a spot too where it's like, well, I'm not sure what to do. There's a lot of that with this. Like, I'm not sure how to handle this, but it made things uncomfortable. Or like you said, that, a person even having to like out themselves, to the point of like, please leave me alone. And even that was not enough,
Sam said that I was a minor. Right?
Yeah.
Said that I'm a lesbian.
Or didn't care more than didn't understand. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Really uncomfortable. Yeah. Did you have a comment on
teaching this in high school yet?
I probably not. I mean, like, I think it's something that's sometimes mentioned, but I don't think they go into a lot of detail.
Like, unfortunately, it's needed.
Yeah.
Younger, right?
Sure.
It wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that it's a part of the curriculum, I'm not sure where it would come up. I mean, it's something that we should all learn about. Like we had to go through, it was last year, I had a 4-hour training on this. And like, even here, like amongst people who are like, who are teachers and educated and like, there was a lot of like joking and like, oh my gosh, this is so stupid and pointless, but it's important. It's important to be aware of how our actions can make somebody comfortable or uncomfortable, right? I worked at Starbucks for years, right? I loved it. It was one of my favorite jobs. But I worked at one in the Valley, and I had a customer who was so inappropriate that I had to quit. Like I would transferred stores. Actually, I didn't like leave, but I transferred stores because like my manager wouldn't do anything about it, right? I had this woman who would come in and she made me so uncomfortable. And my boss actually, who I think really didn't like me, like for whatever reason, would make me go out and interact with this person. Like when she came in, like I was like, please, can you help her? Like, I don't want to help her. Like, she makes me really uncomfortable. And she thought it was hilarious and would push me out there and make me deal with it. And like, I got no support in handling it, whatever. Like this woman, it started out with like very like mild, like joking. And then it was like harassment. It was full on harassment with no support whatsoever. And that can make things really, really like uncomfortable. And again, sometimes you have to leave a job, which shouldn't be the case, but you know, it's like one of those things where I either sit here and tolerate it or I leave. Right. And oftentimes if this is happening, I think the best thing to start with, if you can, and if you feel comfortable, is to talk to the person doing it. Because it might be that they just don't know. Some people are oblivious, right? They don't know that like comments that they're saying or little things that they're doing are making you uncomfortable. And so if you feel comfortable, it could be as simple as like, hey, can you not call me that? Or, hey, like, I'm not interested. Can you stop? Or I don't like when you like put your hand on my shoulder, or, you know, something along those lines. But if that doesn't work or you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can kind of go up, you know, up the ranks, right? So discussing it with a supervisor is usually the first thing to do. Now, ideally, that manager or supervisor is supportive. They do something to help you. If they don't, right, then that makes it harder. And we've heard a couple of stories of that here. So you can file charges. Usually most workplaces have like a phone number that you can call to report somebody, and then they'll guide you through the process. You can find other people who are dealing with the same issue and all do it together. And this is relatively common if, like, let's say it's a group of students or a group of people who are working at a company. You can all report it together and there's some strength in numbers, right? You can file complaints or lawsuits. You can even file criminal charges depending on, you know, what's happening. But I think ideally, if you can, you start with like asking the person to stop. But there are cases where that might not be possible, or maybe you don't feel comfortable, in which case you can kind of go from there, right? But this is unfortunately something that a lot of people do have to deal with. And it can make life a little bit uncomfortable, right? Or even have drastic consequences where you have to leave a job and so on. Any other like stories or thoughts or comments or questions? Anything else here with sexual harassment?
My best friend has two girls and a boy. And
Uh-huh.
she went over this so much with them.
Yeah.
Even like her son being profiled by the girl too. You know, she just saw both sides of it.
Sure.
When her daughter was abroad in college last semester, and they went out and she was the youngest one and they left her. She was so offended.
Wow.
because There's a code, you know.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to like review the idea of consent when you're younger. Like maybe it doesn't have to be in relation to sex, you know, but it could be just in general. Like I had this whole long talk with one of my twins this weekend, my older twin, Emma, about consent. Like she has this habit of like, she'll just keep pushing until someone caves. Right. And I'm like, no, you're not going to do that. Like that there's a problem with that. And like, we're not talking about it in relation to, to sexual harassment. We're just talking about it in relation to consent, right? You don't just, I'm going to point to something I erased, right? You don't just keep pushing somebody until they give in. Like she'll be like, I want X. And then we'll just keep pushing. And my partner and I tried really hard to be like, no, we said no means no. And we're going to teach you that from like a young age. If somebody asks you to stop, whatever it is, you need to stop. Right. And so I think trying to teach some of those things in a broader context when you're younger is important. Right. At least it's something that we're trying to do with our kids. Yeah.
So we're going to take off like they're showing like gentle parenting and
Yeah.
like even with relatives, like if you don't want someone to touch you,
Yeah.
tell them no.
Right.
Well, no.
Mm-hmm.
It's rewarding, but
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that's something that older generations were taught so much, but I love that it is like that consent culture that she mentioned is something that I think we're like pushing a little bit as like a group, which I think is great. Like if you don't want somebody to hug you, you don't want somebody to do whatever, it's okay to tell them that. Right. And that wasn't necessarily a message that has been generationally like present. There was another hint. Yeah.
Teacher, and we offer adjustments for alignment and helping people with their like
form in the postures.
Mhm.
And there's been this one teacher, this like older male that's had a lot of like scandals around touching women inappropriately.
Sure.
And we have precautions, like we give a waiver at the beginning, if you'd like me not to touch you, like feel free to raise your hand and I'll
Yeah.
note that. But he kind of left our studio to another one because of those rumors and everything. And then he got fired from the other place for that same thing and now is back with us and they took him back and it really
Mm.
frustrates me. And I know it's like kind of a hard line knowing like who's comfortable with what, but if it's like a repeated thing, it's probably.
Yeah. Probably more that person than anything, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Situation.
Yeah, and touch is a tricky one. I mean, again, a lot of people doesn't bother them in the slightest, but some people, like if they don't want to be touched, that's their right, right? And to have somebody who's repeatedly like ignoring that is it's definitely not okay, right? 3 years from now, you'll be like, he was fired from us too, right? You never know. I mean, it's tricky. Like you really should be asking for consent, even for something as basic as like, can I put my hand on your shoulder? Is it okay if I do this? Or I'm going to do this. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Should be things you check for, right? Yeah.
What we're talking about made me think of something that literally happened on Thanksgiving this year over this last week. It's weird with like family and asking for consent.
Yeah.
Not necessarily even with like just touching. It's like, so my brother, I think I like touched on this like a long time when we were talking about something else, but my brother always used to be super insecure because he was like little tiny baby funny boy. But now for the last like years, he's been going to the gym, eating the time. And so he's a lot bigger now and he's like a big person now. And so a lot of my like aunts or whatever like will kind of be like, oh my, like take off your shirt, like let me see like what you've been working on and he's like, I don't want to. And so
Yeah.
like in a room, my grandma's room, and it was my grandma and my aunt, and she was like really wanting him to like first she was like, okay, show me your arms, and he like was like, all right, whatever, like do it and it'll be over with. And so
Mhm.
and then she was like, take off your shirt, let me see your chest, blah, blah, blah. And he really didn't want to. And she kept like being like, come on, like it's just me and blah, blah, blah. And
Yeah.
he like kept doing it. And I finally had to say, like, I didn't say anything to her because I didn't, it's a whole thing. But I like looked to him and I was like, you don't have to. You don't have to.
Right.
Because he was getting them in.
Yeah.
But that's happened to him before too, just like throughout his journey of like his body changing.
Mhm.
A lot of people will just like think that they have the right to see him.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's different, especially because he's a boy. So it's like it's different because it's not like, oh, let me see your waist or your boobs or your girl body, you know what I mean? It's like a guy, so it's different, but it's still he didn't want to. And
Yeah.
I don't really respecting. So
And how uncomfortable to be your family too,
and
you know?
I was like, dude.
Yeah.
And I even told her, I was like, girlfriend, I was like, I have to see that every day in my house. I was like, I don't want to see it. So I was trying to be like, I don't even want it.
Trying to diffuse a little bit.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's like respect and
Yeah.
not really like not wanting to say things to your older family members, but it is
Right.
a generational thing, and I just don't think they really know
Yeah.
what they're doing.
And that's something that like we work really hard with our kids too. And I think it's an important skill to have as people to be able to read the room, right? Like if somebody is looking uncomfortable, back off, like stop, right? And that happens a lot where people give you subtle hints that they're not comfortable or like flat out obvious hints that they're not comfortable. And it's important to pick up on those, right? Like families, friends, coworkers, customers, whatever it is, if somebody looks uncomfortable, that's a good indicator that you're making them uncomfortable and should kind of ease off a little bit, right? I had the opposite. My nephew, who's been working out way too much, was wandering around the house like naked, trying to show everyone, well, not 100%, half naked, right? I'm like, naked would have been disturbing, right? Like, half naked, trying to show everyone his muscles, and I wanted him to put his shirt back on, but he was very proud of himself, right? But it's uncomfortable. I mean, it can be family too. It doesn't have to be strangers. It's almost more uncomfortable when it's your family. Yeah.
I went to Santa Cruz for a year last year, and I had this class in my first quarter there, and it was a room of like 400 people. It was a feminist intros to feminism and stuff. And we had to read this like 40-page article about Larry Nassar, the physician who like touched women inappropriately because he said it was whatever. And that class of 400 people, we all read the article, and I remember reading it. I was in my boyfriend's store and I was just like crying because it was so detailed and so disturbing. And then we all got together, all 400 of us. The professor went up and she talked, and it was like silent the whole time. She's talked about it the whole time, and it was so powerful. And that was like one of the times where I was like, this is what everyone says college is. It's like you're going and you're meeting these professors, and it's so powerful. And I felt so lucky to be in that class. And this especially kind of brought back a little bit of that because I kind of forgot about it. But I was just gonna say, if anyone's planning on going to Santa Cruz, take the feminist intros class because it was incredible.
Nice.
It was heavy, but it was so
Yeah.
great.
That is a heavy class, right? I have a minor in like women's studies and like feminist studies, and it's like those classes aren't easy. They can be heavy, but a lot of like issues of consent and power dynamics and things along those lines, right? Is that a
I just thought of a story. It didn't happen to me, but I basically witnessed it. So the old place I used to work at, I was basically in the back counter, and I wasn't a cashier or anything. And there was this one guy, even though I worked in the back, he was the worst. Like an old guy, just to not keep or no hygiene, just worst comments you could hear from the back of the store. So basically there would be a cashier in the front who would just get so uncomfortable, and it got to the point where wherever he walked in, she would just walk in the back. The boss is either stocking shelves or in his office. He would just sit right next to the counter and would just like have his arms crossed, like kind of looking at him the whole time, making sure he doesn't act up. So one time they were so short in the front, I had to help out. So I got to talk to like cashiers, and it's not just the one cashier. Everyone knows this guy. It's like he's just known throughout the whole store. So God bless this person. Basically, she looked him up on, we talked about it, Megan's Law. You can see people online. He was on there. So she printed out his face, and a voodoo doll, put it on a voodoo doll, and got like, whenever he would come in, instead of like saying something, he would just like stab the voodoo doll. And
it's allowed? No. That'd be amazing if that worked, right?
Buildings left, probably burned at some point.
I mean, and like coping with it in whatever way you can find, right? Like obviously it's very creative, but like I mean it's uncomfortable. You don't want to have to deal with those things. And I mean, we've all had bad coworkers, like that happens a lot. I have a few here, right? Like it's everywhere that you are, like you're always going to run into people who might make you uncomfortable. But I think, trying to like read the room, trying to make sure you have consent. And if things are making you uncomfortable, speaking up against them, right? You don't have to tolerate that, right? Even if there are consequences, I think it's better to speak up than it is to continue being uncomfortable in an environment. Yeah.
As a therapist, what do you do when you have a patient client who has buried all that? And there's something in there.
Yeah.
Really,
As far as like they've had like what buried all of
dad was basically a psychopath. So there was rape, there was killing of their pets in front of them. Wow, it was horrible.
Yeah.
Abuse, beatings, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And all of them, all 6 of them are, impacted.
Sure.
But one of them, when she was 6, she remembers this clearly. He tried to touch her. She got out of bed. She stared him down. She left the room. And he was horrible to her. I mean, she says she thinks he's probably afraid to let anyone get close to her. But she knows stuff that like they've never sat down and talked about it.
Yeah. It's hard too when people experience any kind of trauma, especially when they're younger, even if it's complex or simple trauma, like simple being like one event. Oftentimes they do bury it, right? And then it comes out in other ways. And so, usually what happens is getting into therapy, right? And then it starts to, when you develop enough trust with the therapist, it might start to come out. Right. And so it can take a little bit of time because typically someone who's undergone like childhood trauma or been violated in some way, whether that's emotionally or physically or whatnot, there's a lot of like trust issues that develop. And so it can take some time for that person to feel comfortable enough to maybe divulge it. Or it might be that the therapist sees signs of it and like probes a little bit into it. But I mean, it can take some time is the sad part. Right.
They want to get.
Right. You have to hit a point where you're ready. And sometimes people do repress or like block out, push down trauma. And then it comes out in unexpected ways. Like maybe they don't understand why something is such a trigger for them. Like it could be a sound or a smell or being touched in a certain part of your body, right? Like could be a trigger that you don't fully understand because you blocked it out. And so then it's processing those triggers. You know, we've talked about it in abnormal psych with like EMDR and things like that, like could be really helpful for that. But there does have to be a level of like, you know, feeling safe enough to trust that person to divulge it, which can take time.
Years.
Yeah, years. It could take years and it could be never. You know, sometimes people repress it so strongly that it just doesn't come up. Yeah.
I'm taking an EMDR for kids seminar as well as a trauma-informed yoga seminar.
Interesting.
And so if anybody is interested in that, wants me to send them the information if you want to learn more about that, and then helps me facilitate it and things like that.
Cool.
You say EMDR.
Yeah, so EMDR, eye movement. Yeah, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, just in case you weren't sure what EMDR stands for. The idea is like bilateral stimulation of the brain to help deal with trauma. Really fascinating, right? And it's something that can be very helpful for people who've undergone one of these things. Any of the things that we've talked about here would be considered trauma, right? This is all trauma stuff, right? Which is why it's not the easiest topic. And so typically in order to overcome a trauma, you have to face it in some way. And one of the ways that people sometimes face it is through therapy. And through therapy, you can do things like EMDR, right? And so EMDR, what it does is it helps your brain like digest a trauma and process it so it's not stuck, is the thought anyway. And so doing that for one of these things can actually be quite helpful, but somebody has to be ready. It's a very intense process, but it can be incredibly cathartic and helpful if you do choose to undergo it. Yeah.
I was so upset. My therapist said you didn't with me, and then I gave a whole presentation about it to my school.
Yeah.
And that's when I met my boyfriend, because he was like, really, like, I'm like,
Thank you. Bonding over trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Right. Yeah. So I obviously like have a strong background in therapy and counseling. I teach abnormal psych right after this. A few of you are in there with me. And we talked a lot about EMDR. It can be really helpful for like processing traumas and what happens is trigger traumatic things that happened to us earlier in life that we might not even be aware of. And something that's not in proportion to the situation. Sometimes we call that a trailhead. And so what happens is that the event now is activating something that happened to you in the past and making it stronger. And in those cases, you know, it might be that you have a traumatic, you know, incident that happened that you are aware of or not, right? In those cases, therapy is really, really helpful for, especially EMDR. I like EMDR as well. It's very, very, very interesting. Okay, last one. Intimate partner violence used to be called domestic violence. They changed the name to be a little more inclusive to intimate partner violence. This is any kind of coercive behavior designed to exert power or control over somebody that you're in an intimate relationship with, right? Through intimidation, threats, harmful or harassing behavior. This is somebody that maybe you're married to or in a long-term committed relationship with, or it could even be somebody that you're just dating, like, but it's between two people in an intimate relationship. And this tends to be something that's very, very cyclical, right? It's this ongoing cycle and people have a very hard time breaking out of it. So what happens is you have like a long-term pattern of like kind of like normal behavior, right? Like normal or typical behavior within the relationship. Everything is kind of going on like normal. And then something happens which causes an incident of abuse. Now, the abuse could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be sexual, it could be somebody like hitting you, throwing something at you, like could be anything, right? Any kind of like physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And then what typically happens after that is the person who committed that feels bad, right? They feel guilty. So they feel like remorse or guilt. Like, I didn't mean to do that. I feel really bad about it. And so what that leads to is like very sweet, loving behavior. Maybe they get you flowers or they get you a gift or they like apologize and they're excessively kind for a time, like trying to make up for it, right? They feel bad about what they did. And then some kind of stressor or event happens again, right? And then we go back and we have like abuse, right? And then again and again and again. And it's this kind of pattern. But oftentimes what'll happen is the person who's the victim of this, well, they really feel bad about it. They promise they'll never do it again. They were really kind and they like made up for it. Like they're trying really hard. And then it happens again, right? And so it's this cycle that people oftentimes have a very hard time getting out of or walking away from. It's often very much so a pattern rather than like an isolated incident. And people will make excuses, right? Oh, like they're trying, right? They're not perfect, but neither am I. And like kind of making excuses for it and like staying in relationships where they're, you know, maybe potentially being very physically or emotionally or sexually like abused, right? And this is something that you can see happen a lot, right? And again, people oftentimes have a hard time like walking away. A lot of like movies and shows highlighting this. Yeah.
So, friend of mine, he has this girlfriend, she's
Uh-huh.
really toxic.
Okay.
And so like they're on line 360 together.
Mhm.
Whenever he and I are in the car and let's say we're going a fair amount over the speed limit, she'll text and ask me, what are you doing?
Sure.
Or like if a girl compliments him on his hair, she gets furious. Is this considered that, or is that just a toxic girlfriend?
It's hard because toxic can very much be abusive, right? Or not. Like it's tricky. Like some people are just naturally kind of like negative and toxic but it can easily become this, right? Like if they're insulting and like demeaning or like oppressive, like all of those things are forms of abuse if like they are strong enough. And that's another tricky thing with this is everyone has a different line. Right. And so like somebody might be fine with that, like, and it doesn't bother them. And maybe they're even the same way back. And for other people, that could like cause all sorts of problems and be emotionally difficult, in which case it would definitely fall in here. So it could be, right? Some people are naturally like just toxic and they have that negative like energy to them. But if it's bothering somebody else and making them uncomfortable or hurting them, then it definitely falls into that category. Other comments or thoughts or stories? Anything else here? I have a song to play for you related to this. Are you excited? Right. I don't know, maybe not. So what I want to do, I'm gonna give you a copy of the lyrics. Right. Look, I'm just leaving you in suspense for as long as possible. It's not a cat. I don't know if they're very fun. But it's Love the Way You Lie by I think what's great about the song is the video really like adds to it. So I'm giving you the lyrics. And then on the back, it's a question that you're going to answer afterward, and then you'll turn this into me. I'm going to have you work on this in groups. But as you're listening to the song, what you might want to do is like underline or highlight anything that you hear in the lyrics that like is a good example. So what you're going to do afterward is you're going to get into groups, and I'm going to have you make like a bulleted list of some of the ways that the lyrics, the song, and the video, let's add the video in there, are representative of an abusive relationship. Now you could easily say the whole thing, okay, but I want you to try and be a little more specific than that. So try and find some specific examples. There are quite a few of them, but I'll play the video for you. So follow along. Here are your lyrics. And then I'll have you get into groups and kind of talk about it and write some stuff down afterward. But I think this song and the video, really good examples of intimate partner violence. It's very obvious and blatant. Sometimes this can be very subtle, kind of like you were asking about. It can be a very subtle thing. People can use money as a way to have intimate partner violence, like holding money and finances over someone's head is a very subtle way that this can be done. This is a very blatant example, but I think it's a good one anyway, so I will play it for you. What are some of the specific lyrics that maybe jumped out at you, or maybe something you saw in the video? You can work on it with a couple other people if you want, or you can do it on your own, totally up to you. But I'll give you a few minutes. We'll see if we have a minute to kind of touch on it, but take a few minutes, try and write down some stuff. And if it's easier, you could always underline the lyrics and put an arrow next to it. That's fine too.
I said very bond in the last 2 years. It's like that's even love leaders. It's like,
I was thinking the actual role of the lady, it's just like a very. It's toxic.
yeah, something should be really
Thoughts, maybe we'll talk about it maybe next time, but try and get some more thoughts. So what I'll do is I'll collect these from you, so you don't have to worry about like holding on to it or losing it potentially or anything between now and Wednesday. But on Wednesday, when we start, we're gonna talk about it just a little bit and wrap up our thoughts, see if there's any other questions or comments since we're out of time. And then we'll move on to chapter 18. We get a slightly lighter topic of pornography, prostitution, and selling sex on Wednesday. Like I think it's a little more entertaining and lighter, right? I have some scandalous ads to share with you, which should be kind of fun. So as you leave today, if you could turn those and make sure your name is on it, and then we'll talk about it briefly Wednesday and go from there. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. I'll see you on Wednesday.